In Tokyo Dome, a soft-spoken martial arts legend was about to face five of the deadliest champions alive. What began as a global exhibition celebrating the harmony of combat disciplines turned deadly when five reigning MMA titleists decided to humiliate Chuck Norris live on stage. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical guest of honor. For over 6 decades, he had been a world karate champion, U.S. Air Force veteran, and the founder of Chun Kuk Do, known for teaching generations that mastery isn't about domination, but control. When the five champions surrounded him in mock challenge, they had no idea they were provoking a lifetime of discipline sharpened into instinct. Chuck's calm deflection of their every strike, and his refusal to meet arrogance with aggression, would turn their spectacle into revelation, leaving millions of viewers questioning everything they thought they knew about power. What began as a public stunt meant to embarrass an old legend would become a night of awakening that redefined martial arts itself. The Tokyo Dome and the entire fighting world would never be the same after five champions knelt before the man they came to destroy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Tokyo Dome gleamed like a pearlescent spaceship beneath the night sky, its curved roof catching the dance of spotlights that swept across the city. Inside, 20,000 souls created a thunderous roar that seemed to make the very air vibrate. The International Martial Arts Expo had transformed Japan's most iconic venue into a global crossroads where tradition met modernity, where the raw power of combat sports collided with the spectacle of entertainment. Aiko Sato adjusted her earpiece, the red light of the camera blinking as she prepared for her live broadcast. At 32, she'd covered everything from Olympic judo to underground fight clubs. But tonight felt different. The energy crackling through the arena wasn't just excitement, it carried an edge of something primal. We're live. In 3, 2. The cameraman's fingers counted down silently. Good evening from the heart of Tokyo. Aiko's voice carried the perfect blend of authority and enthusiasm. I'm Aiko Sato, reporting live from what might be the most anticipated martial arts event in decades. Tonight's Legends vs. Champions showcase brings together the icons who defined combat sports with the new generation who are redefining it. The camera panned across the crowd, capturing the sea of phones recording every moment. The national flags waving from every section. The celebrities and fighters dotting the front rows. Among tonight's honored guests, Aiko continued, former champions from across the disciplines: karate, judo, Muay Thai, and of course, she gestured toward the VIP section, the man who brought martial arts into mainstream Western consciousness through his films and competition career, Chuck Norris. The camera found him immediately, a man in his early 80s who somehow seemed both older and younger than his years. Chuck sat with perfect posture at ringside, his weathered face lined with experience but his eyes clear and alert. He wore a simple black button-up shirt, no flashy jewelry or logos. Unlike the entourages surrounding other celebrities, Chuck sat with just a single aide, a quiet presence in the midst of chaos. But tonight isn't just about honoring the past, Aiko pivoted, her tone shifting subtly. It's about showcasing the present and perhaps settling some long-debated questions about how the legends of yesterday would fare against the champions of today. The main screen above the arena flashed to life, with a montage of 5 fighters, each clip more spectacular than the last. The crowd's roar intensified with each familiar face. Kai, the Cobra Tanaka, appeared first, a lightweight fighter with movements so fluid they seemed to defy physics. The Japanese home crowd erupted as footage played of his signature spinning back kick, the one that had made him a social media sensation even before he claimed the championship. Titan Brooks followed, a mountain of a man whose heavyweight frame somehow moved with terrifying speed. His knockout reel showed opponents falling like trees, their consciousness severed with single, devastating blows. Rafael El Relampago Cruz appeared next, the Mexican featherweight's technical precision drawing appreciative murmurs even from this Japanese crowd. His fighting style was mathematical, clinical, a chess master's approach to violence. Yuri Iron Wolf Petrov's cold, expressionless face filled the screen next. The Russian middleweight never smiled, never taunted, never celebrated. He simply dismantled opponents with mechanical efficiency, his face showing as much emotion as the mat beneath his feet. Finally came Malik, the Lion Adewale, the Nigerian welterweight, whose charisma threatened to overshadow even his considerable fighting skills. His highlight reel showed not just victories but performances, a fighter who understood that modern combat was as much about storytelling as it was technique. Together they represented 5 weight classes, 5 fighting styles, 5 personalities, and most importantly, 5 massive egos. The lights dimmed, and a spotlight hit the center of the stage where all 5 champions now stood in a lineup that radiated raw physical power and absolute confidence. The Expo's director, a small, nervous man in a tailored suit, approached the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our showcase event where legends meet champions." The crowd's response was deafening. Tonight's exhibition matches will feature demonstrations from both our honored legends and our reigning champions. But first, let's hear from our current title holders. Gentlemen, Kai Tanaka stepped forward first, taking the microphone with practiced ease. At 26, his boyish face contrasted with the intricate dragon tattoos wrapping his arms. "Tokyo! My home!" he called out, drawing cheers. "It's an honor to be here with these great champions." He nodded to his fellow fighters before his smile took on a sharper edge. "And it's interesting to see the legends too. The men whose posters hung on our walls when we were kids. The men who made movies about what we actually do for real." A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the crowd. Somewhere in the production booth, an executive winced. "I mean, no disrespect," Kai continued, his tone suggesting exactly the opposite. "But there's a difference between choreography and combat, between making movies and making history." His gaze drifted deliberately toward the VIP section where Chuck Norris sat, still as stone. "Some of us had to prove ourselves in the cage, not on a movie set with stunt coordinators and second takes." The crowd's reaction was mixed, shocked gasps interlaced with scattered applause and nervous laughter. Titan Brooks grabbed the microphone next, his massive frame making Kai look like a child beside him. "What my friend is trying to say," his deep voice boomed, "is that we're grateful to the pioneers. They paved the way." He paused, his smile revealing the predatory edge beneath his public persona. But let's be honest. The sport evolved. What worked in the 70 seconds and 80 seconds would get you killed today. The legends are legends because they never had to face fighters like us. The atmosphere in the arena shifted perceptibly. What had been marketed as a respectful showcase was veering into uncomfortable territory. The director stepped forward to reclaim the microphone, but Rafael Cruz intercepted it. "Perhaps it is not about who would win," the Mexican fighter said, his accent thick, but his English precise. "Perhaps it is about respecting the journey of martial arts. From traditional to modern, from performance to competition." His diplomatic words were undercut by the coldness in his eyes. "But if one were to wonder, yes, I believe there is no comparison between then and now. Science, nutrition, training methods, all have advanced. We stand on their shoulders, yes, but we stand much taller." In the front row, Chuck Norris remained expressionless. Not angry, not offended, not even visibly interested, just watching, observing with eyes that seemed to take in everything without revealing anything in return. Yuri Petrov declined the microphone when it was offered to him, merely nodding in agreement with his colleagues. His silence somehow felt more dismissive than their words. Malik Adewale took the microphone last, his charismatic presence immediately commanding the space. Unlike the others, he approached the edge of the stage, looking directly at the Legends section. "I grew up watching Chuck Norris films," he said, his voice carrying both warmth and challenge. "Walker, Texas Ranger was my favorite show as a boy in Lagos." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the audience. Chuck's expression remained unchanged. "I practiced his kicks in my mother's living room," Malik continued. "I admired him. I still do." His tone shifted slightly. "But admiration doesn't mean we can't acknowledge reality. These men were giants in a smaller world. We compete in a global arena they never had to face." He turned back to address the entire stadium. "So yes, we respect the legends. But respect doesn't mean we pretend. It doesn't mean we have to act like the martial arts peaked in 1985. He laughed, encouraging the crowd to join him. Many did. Malik handed the microphone back to the flustered director, who quickly tried to steer the event back to its intended course. "Thank you, champions, for your candid perspectives. Now, let's begin our showcase with—" "Wait," Kai interrupted, stepping forward again. "I have a proposition." The director hesitated, then reluctantly surrendered the microphone again. "Why just talk?" Kai's eyes gleamed with mischief and something darker. "We have legends here. We have champions here. The fans deserve more than words." An anticipatory hush fell over the arena. "Mr. Norris," Kai called out, addressing Chuck directly for the first time. "You're here as an honored guest. But I think the fans would be more honored to see what you can still do." He spread his arms wide. "Not in movies. Not in stories. Here. Now. Real." 20,000 people seemed to hold their breath at once. Chuck Norris remained seated, his expression unchanged. If the challenge registered with him at all, his face betrayed nothing. "What do you say, legend?" Kai pressed, his smile growing sharper. "One round. Friendly exhibition. Show these fans if the myths are true." In the press area, Aiko Sato leaned forward, suddenly aware she was witnessing something unscripted and potentially explosive. Her producer was shouting in her earpiece, but she barely heard him. The 5 champions had formed a loose semicircle on stage, their body language making it clear this was no spontaneous challenge, but a planned provocation. "Maybe he doesn't hear well anymore," Titan Brooks' stage whispered, loud enough for the microphone to catch. A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the crowd. "Or maybe," Raphael added smoothly, "there are some legends best left untested." Still, Chuck did not move, did not speak, did not react. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Then, in the front row, something changed. Not in Chuck's expression that remained impassive, but in his energy. He shifted his weight slightly, and somehow that minuscule movement carried more presence than all the champions' words combined. The director, sensing disaster, rushed forward. "Let's thank our champions and move on to—" "No," came a single word, spoken not loudly but with such clarity it cut through the arena noise like a blade. Chuck Norris had spoken. The crowd fell silent. The champions exchanged glances. The director froze mid-gesture. Chuck stood slowly. He didn't hurry, didn't posture. At 80+ years his movements were deliberate, but they carried no hesitation, no weakness. He didn't speak again immediately. Instead, he simply looked at each of the 5 champions in turn. his gaze level and unreadable. "You want to test legends," he finally said, his voice carrying easily despite its quietness. "But you misunderstand what makes a legend in the first place." He stepped forward, declining the hand offered by security to help him toward the stage. Though his pace was measured, there was nothing frail in his movement. The crowd parted before him, whispers rippling outward like waves. "A true martial artist," Chuck continued as he approached the stage. "Fights not to prove himself to others, but to master himself." He climbed the short steps to the platform where the 5 champions waited, their earlier bravado now tempered with uncertainty. Up close, they towered over him, physically younger, faster, stronger by every measurable metric. Yet somehow, it was Chuck who seemed to fill the space. "But since you've invited me," he said with the faintest hint of a smile, "it would be impolite to refuse." A roar erupted from the crowd. Confusion, excitement, disbelief, all mixing into a wall of sound. Phones lifted higher. Social media exploded with real-time reactions. Aiko Sato was already narrating the unfolding drama for her global audience, trying to capture the electric atmosphere that had transformed what should have been a ceremonial event into something unprecedented. In the shadows backstage, an elderly Japanese man watched silently. Sensei Kuroda had been Chuck's friend and occasional training partner for over 40 years. His lined face betrayed nothing, but those who knew him well might have caught the subtle nod of approval. The 5 champions stood in a loose formation, their challenge now answered in a way none of them had truly expected. They had sought to elevate themselves by diminishing a legend. Instead, they found the legend standing among them, not in grainy footage or nostalgic memories, but in flesh and blood, quiet, composed, and completely unintimidated. As the event director frantically consulted with security and legal teams about the liability implications, Chuck Norris stood perfectly still at the center of the storm, his calm presence a stark contrast to the chaos swirling around him. The night that had begun as a celebration of martial arts history was about to become history itself. And somewhere in the crowd, fans who had come expecting mere entertainment were about to witness something far more profound. A lesson in the true meaning of mastery, delivered not through words, but through action. The first test was about to begin. The air in Tokyo Dome had transformed from entertainment into anticipation. That electric silence before lightning strikes. The event director whispered frantically into his headset. Production assistants scrambled, and legal representatives exchanged alarmed glances. What had been meticulously planned was now veering into uncharted territory. But for 20,000 spectators, nothing existed beyond the tableau unfolding before them. 5 champions in their prime facing a legend many had written off as a relic of another era. Chuck Norris stood at the center of the stage, still and composed. Despite being in his 80s, his posture betrayed no weakness. His eyes remained clear and focused. He had said little, but his presence filled the arena with an authority that needed no amplification. "Kai, the Cobra." Tanaka stepped forward, unable to contain the nervous energy that had always fueled his fighting style. At 26, the Japanese lightweight champion embodied the new generation of martial artists, flashy, technical, and raised on social media where showmanship often outweighed substance. Tonight, he wore designer training pants and a fitted shirt emblazoned with his personal logo and sponsor patches. "So," Kai said, his amplified voice carrying an edge of mockery, "the legend accepts." He circled Chuck once, bouncing slightly on his toes. "Any special rules we should know about? Things that might be too hard on your experience?" A few scattered laughs rippled through the crowd, but most remained hushed, watching intently. Chuck's expression didn't change. "No rules," Chuck replied simply. just respect. The event director finally reached the stage, perspiration beading on his forehead. "Gentlemen, please, this isn't part of the sanctioned program. We can't allow an unscheduled—" "Let them have the floor," came a commanding voice from the side of the stage. The owner of the expo, Takashi Miyamoto, stepped into view, a shrewd businessman who recognized the marketing goldmine unfolding before him. "This is what the people came to see." The director hesitated, then reluctantly retreated. Production crews scrambled to adjust lighting and camera angles. Medical staff moved closer to the stage. Social media feeds across the globe exploded with breaking news alerts. Chuck Norris accepts live challenge from MMA champions. Kai didn't waste the opportunity. He gestured to the center of the stage, which had been set up as a demonstration area with protective mats. "After you, Mr. Legend," he said with an exaggerated bow. Chuck walked unhurriedly to the center. He removed his watch, handing it to a nearby staff member. He didn't stretch, didn't prepare, didn't play to the crowd. He simply stood, feet positioned in a subtle stance that most observers wouldn't even recognize as a fighting posture. In the press area, Aiko Sato pressed her earpiece closer. "We're witnessing something unprecedented," she narrated, her professional veneer barely containing her own excitement. Five-time lightweight champion Kai Tanaka appears to be challenging Chuck Norris to what's being called a friendly exhibition. But the tension in this arena suggests there's nothing friendly about what we're about to see. The other four champions had moved to the edges of the stage, forming a loose semicircle. Their expressions ranged from Titan's gleeful anticipation to Yuri's cold assessment. Malik stood slightly apart, his eyes narrowed, studying Chuck with an intensity that betrayed conflicted emotions. "So how do we do this?" Kai asked, now bouncing actively from foot to foot, shaking out his limbs with the practiced routine of a fighter preparing for combat. "Light contact? Demo speed? Or are we actually testing skills here?" The question carried an unmistakable challenge. Chuck regarded him calmly. "You issued the invitation. Your terms." Kai's smile widened. He glanced at his fellow champions, then at the crowd, playing to both audiences. "Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Well, since you're giving me the choice." He dropped into a fighting stance, hands raised, weight balanced. "Let's keep it real. No choreography. No movie stunts. Just fighting." A murmur rippled through the arena. Even Titan looked momentarily concerned at the escalation. Chuck, however, simply nodded once. "Remember," Chuck said quietly, "you wanted this." Without warning, Kai launched forward. A blindingly fast jab aimed at Chuck's midsection. A probe, a test, delivered with enough speed that most opponents would flinch or retreat. Chuck didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't retreat. His hand intercepted Kai's wrist with such minimal movement it seemed almost casual, redirecting the strike to pass harmlessly by his side. Kai blinked in surprise, but recovered instantly. He followed with a combination jab, cross, leg kick, delivered with the speed that had made him champion. Each motion blurred with precision, the attacks flowing seamlessly into one another. Chuck's defense was economical to the point of appearing effortless. Where Kai exploded with energy, Chuck conserved it. Where Kai attacked with complexity, Chuck responded with simplicity. He didn't block so much as redirect, didn't counter so much as position himself where Kai's strikes couldn't reach. The crowd watched in growing amazement. They had expected to see an old man humiliated. Instead, they were witnessing a masterclass in efficiency. Frustrated, Kai escalated, launching a spinning back kick, his signature move, the one that had made him famous, the one that had ended championships. It came with blinding speed, perfect technique, and genuine power. Chuck sidestepped it with such timing that Kai's leg missed by millimeters. As the young fighter's momentum carried him past, Chuck placed a single hand on Kai's shoulder. Not a strike, not even a push, just enough contact to disrupt the champion's balance. Kai stumbled, caught himself, and spun back with wide eyes. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. "Lucky dodge," he muttered. But there was less conviction in his voice. "No such thing as luck," Chuck replied quietly. "Only preparation meeting opportunity." Kai reset his stance, the playfulness gone from his expression. He attacked again, this time with a furious combination designed to overwhelm through sheer volume: punches, elbows, knees, kicks coming from all angles, the kind of assault that had broken his previous opponents. Yet somehow, Chuck remained untouched. He moved with an economy that defied his age, always just beyond Kai's reach or just inside it, where the strikes lost their power. He didn't retreat or circle away. He simply wasn't where the attacks landed. The crowd's reaction transformed from curiosity to awe. Phones recorded every moment. Commentary booths struggled to explain what they were seeing. In the front row, Sensei Kuroda watched with the faintest smile. Decades ago, he had told his young American student that true mastery wasn't about adding techniques, but about distilling them to their essence. He was witnessing that essence now. Kai's frustration mounted visibly. Sweat beaded on his forehead as his attacks grew increasingly wild, increasingly desperate. His technique began to fray at the edges. Precision sacrificed for power. Strategy abandoned for emotion. "Fight back!" he finally shouted, breathing heavily. "I'm not here to fight," Chuck responded evenly. "I'm here to teach." Something in those simple words struck deeper than any physical blow. Kai's expression twisted with a complex mixture of anger, embarrassment, and dawning respect. He launched forward with one final, all-out assault, a flying knee followed by a haymaker. Technique replaced by raw determination to land just one clean hit on the legend. Chuck moved then not backward, but forward, into the attack. His movements were so subtle most observers couldn't track them. But suddenly, Kai found himself off balance. His momentum carried past his target. Chuck had executed a simple hip deflection, the most basic of techniques taught to first-year martial arts students, but with such perfect timing that Kai's own force betrayed him. The champion stumbled, then fell, sprawling forward onto the mat. The arena went silent. Kai lay there for a moment, more shocked than hurt. When he pushed himself up to his knees, his face burned with humiliation. He had been handled, not beaten, not struck, not even thrown, but simply managed, like a child having a tantrum. Chuck stood exactly where he had been, not even breathing hard, showing neither triumph nor contempt. He simply extended a hand toward the fallen fighter. Kai stared at the offered hand, conflict plain on his face. Pride warred with respect, ego with honor. For several heartbeats, 20,000 spectators watched this internal battle play across the young champion's features. Then, slowly, Kai reached up and took Chuck's hand. The crowd erupted in applause, not the bloodthirsty roar of combat sports, but something deeper, more appreciative. They had witnessed not just skill, but wisdom, not domination, but instruction. As Chuck helped Kai to his feet, he spoke quietly. His words not meant for the microphones or the crowd, but for the young fighter alone. Speed is nothing without control. Control is nothing without purpose. Purpose is nothing without humility. Kai's expression shifted, anger giving way to something more complex, the disorientation of having one's worldview suddenly challenged. He nodded once, the gesture small but significant. From the side of the stage, Titan Brooks stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow across the demonstration area. Unlike Kai's almost playful challenge, Titan's approach carried unmistakable menace. "Cute little demonstration," the heavyweight drawled into a microphone, his American accent cutting through the arena. "But speed games don't work with power." He handed the microphone to Raphael and cracked his knuckles theatrically. "Let's see how redirection works against someone who can break you in half." Sensei Kuroda shook his head slightly. The young ones never learned. They sought wisdom only after exhausting all other options. Chuck turned toward the approaching heavyweight, his expression unchanged. He had known this wouldn't end with one challenger. The lesson was just beginning. "One down, 4 to go," called someone from the crowd, triggering a wave of excited murmurs. In her broadcast position, Aiko Sato struggled to maintain journalistic neutrality. "What we've just witnessed defies explanation," she reported, her voice tight with controlled excitement. Kai Tanaka, arguably the fastest fighter in MMA today, unable to land a single strike on Chuck Norris. But now it appears Titan Brooks, a man who outweighs Mr. Norris by at least 100 pounds, is stepping up to continue this unprecedented challenge. The atmosphere in Tokyo Dome crackled with renewed tension. The first confrontation had been a lesson in speed versus control. The second promised to test wisdom against raw power. Chuck stood calmly at the center of the storm, waiting for the next challenger, his silence more eloquent than any boast could ever be. Titan Brooks strode toward the center of the mat, each footfall landing with deliberate heaviness. At 6'6" and 265 pounds of sculpted muscle, the American heavyweight champion cast a shadow that seemed to engulf Chuck Norris completely. The contrast was stark: Chuck's modest stature and unassuming presence against Titan's overwhelming physicality. The crowd's energy shifted palpably. Where Kai's challenge had carried an element of playfulness beneath the disrespect, Titan's approach felt dangerous. His eyes held none of the Japanese fighter's mischief, only cold calculation and the absolute certainty of physical dominance. "Not gonna waste time with fancy moves," Titan announced, his voice carrying easily without the microphone. He cracked his neck from side to side, the sound audible even over the crowd's murmurs. "Just gonna show everyone what happens when movies meet reality." Chuck remained where he stood, his breathing even, his stance neutral. To casual observers, he might have appeared completely relaxed, almost vulnerable. But those with trained eyes noticed the subtle weight distribution, the grounded posture, the readiness that required no visible tension. In the VIP section, several retired fighters leaned forward in their seats. They had competed in eras when weight classes mattered less, when a smaller fighter might face someone 30 pounds heavier. Even so, the disparity before them now seemed beyond reasonable, like watching a pickup truck bear down on a mailbox. "Mr. Norris," the event director called nervously from the edge of the stage, "perhaps we should implement some basic safety protocols." He said no rules. Titan cut in, rolling his massive shoulders. "Man's choice. I respect that, at least." The word respect carried an unmistakable edge of mockery. Chuck nodded once, the gesture so minimal it might have been missed if not for the intense focus directed at him from every angle. "Your terms," he repeated simply. "My terms are simple," Titan replied, dropping into a fighting stance that showcased his mixed background. Part boxing, part wrestling. The hybrid approach that had made modern MMA so devastating. "I touch you, you lose." A ripple of concern moved through the crowd. This was no longer about exhibition or demonstration. Titan's intention was clearly humiliation. Aiko Sato's producer was frantically gesturing for security intervention, but the broadcast continued uninterrupted. This was content gold, regardless of the ethical concerns. What appears to be unfolding now is a completely unsanctioned confrontation, Aiko narrated, professional calm, barely masking her own apprehension. Heavyweight champion Titan Brooks, known for having ended 3 careers with legitimate injuries in the octagon, appears intent on physical confrontation with Chuck Norris, who, we should remind viewers, is in his 80s. From his position at ringside, Sensei Kuroda watched impassively. Unlike the concerned spectators, he showed no alarm. His eyes held not fear but anticipation, the quiet knowledge of what was about to unfold. Titan didn't wait for formal commencement. With surprising speed for his size, he launched forward, a freight train of focused aggression. His first strike was a probing jab, heavy, even when restrained, designed to establish distance and dominance. Chuck slipped it with minimal movement, angling his body just enough for the massive fist to pass harmlessly by his temple. The evasion was so subtle that Titan's momentum carried him slightly off balance, not enough to compromise him, but enough to register as unexpected. The heavyweight corrected immediately, following with a thunderous right cross that whistled through the space Chuck had occupied milliseconds before. Again, Chuck's evasion was economic, no wasted motion, no dramatic ducking or diving, just precisely enough movement to render the attack ineffective. Frustration flickered across Titan's face. He reset his stance. This time, approaching more methodically. "Can't run forever, old man," he growled. "Stage only has so much room." "I haven't moved more than 2 feet," Chuck replied quietly. And it was true. While Kai had been forced to chase his elusive opponent, Chuck was containing Titan's aggression in a remarkably small space. The observation seemed to trigger something in the heavyweight. His next attack came as a furious combination jab, cross, uppercut, hook, each blow carrying knockout power. The sequence delivered with surprising technical proficiency for someone his size. To the astonishment of the crowd, Chuck neither retreated nor blocked in the conventional sense. He moved into the attacks, his positioning so precise that Titan's crushing blows found only air where vulnerable targets should have been. It was like watching someone navigate between raindrops. "Impossible," Raphael murmured from the sidelines, the technician in him struggling to process the mechanics of what he was witnessing. Titan's frustration mounted visibly. He had built his career on intimidation, followed by overwhelming force. When opponents feared him, they made mistakes. When they made mistakes, he punished them. But the man before him showed no fear, made no mistakes, and seemed to anticipate every move before it happened. "Enough games," he roared, abandoning measured approach for raw aggression. He lunged forward, massive arms extended to grapple, to clinch, to use his overwhelming size advantage. In that moment, Chuck finally moved decisively. As Titan's bulk crashed forward, Chuck executed a technique so fundamental it was often overlooked in modern fighting, a simple hip shift, combined with wrist control, using the attacker's forward momentum. What happened next defied the expectations of everyone watching. Titan's own charge became his undoing. Chuck redirected rather than resisted, adding the smallest amount of his own energy to the equation. The result was spectacular in its simplicity. The heavyweight champion of the world sailed past Chuck, balance completely compromised, massive frame airborne for a suspended moment before crashing to the mat with shocking force. The impact reverberated through the stage. Titan lay stunned, not from injury, but from sheer disbelief. He had not been struck, had not been thrown in any conventional sense. He had been guided into defeating himself. The arena exploded in astonished reaction. Gasps, cheers, and the frantic clicking of thousands of camera phones capturing the moment that would dominate social media within seconds. Chuck stood exactly where he had been. Unchanged, unboastful. He turned slightly to look at the fallen champion, with neither triumph nor disdain, only quiet acknowledgement. Titan pushed himself to his knees, then to his feet, his face darkening with humiliation and rage. For a dangerous moment, it appeared he might abandon all pretense of exhibition and launch a genuinely violent attack. "That was a trick," he spat. "A lucky move." Chuck regarded him steadily. "There's an old saying in martial arts. If I have to use physical force, I've already made a mistake." "What's that supposed to mean?" Titan demanded, his fists clenching. "It means true power isn't about domination," Chuck replied, his voice carrying a quiet authority that somehow reached every corner of the now hushed arena. "It's about control, especially self-control." Something in those words seemed to penetrate Titan's anger. He stood breathing heavily, massive chest rising and falling, internal conflict plain on his face. The spotlight caught beads of sweat on his forehead, not from exertion but from the unfamiliar experience of being completely outmatched. In the press area, Aiko Sato was struggling to maintain her professional composure. "What we're witnessing defies conventional understanding of physical confrontation," she narrated. Titan Brooks, a man who has defeated opponents through sheer overwhelming force, just found himself on the mat without a single blow being landed. The technique Chuck Norris employed appeared to be basic leverage and timing, but executed with a level of precision that transforms simplicity into artistry. On the stage, Titan had regained his physical composure, but something fundamental had changed in his demeanor. The swagger had diminished. Replaced by a wary respect he seemed uncomfortable acknowledging. "One more," he said, the challenge in his voice now tempered with uncertainty. "Let me try once more." Chuck nodded. "Your choice." Titan approached again, this time with careful measure in his steps. He had abandoned wild aggression, now moving with deliberate intent. His attack, when it came, was controlled, a measured combination, followed by a clinch attempt designed to trap Chuck in his crushing grip. Again, Chuck's response appeared effortless. He didn't oppose Titan's force, but harmonized with it. Where the heavyweight pushed, Chuck redirected. Where Titan pulled, Chuck yielded, then reversed. It was like watching water flow around stone, inevitable, efficient, and ultimately unstoppable. This time, when Titan found himself off balance, the experience was more bewildering than humiliating. He hadn't been outpowered, he had been outpositioned. Chuck had placed a single hand on Titan's wrist, another on his elbow, and suddenly the champion's 100-pound advantage meant nothing. "It's not about strength," Chuck said quietly as Titan steadied himself. "It's about understanding force and its application. The same principles that allow a small dam to hold back a river." Titan straightened to his full height, towering over Chuck. But his posture had changed. The intimidation was gone, replaced with a reluctant reassessment. He studied the older man with new eyes, seeing beyond age to the lifetime of mastery it represented. "I've trained with Olympic wrestlers and world champion boxers," Titan said, his voice stripped of bravado. "Never felt anything like that." Chuck offered the slightest nod, not acknowledgement of praise, but recognition of the younger fighter's perceptiveness. "Because they're still thinking about fighting," Chuck replied. "Not about harmony." The heavyweight's brow furrowed at this. Philosophical concepts clearly outside his usual consideration. But seeds had been planted in ground previously, too hard to receive them. Without another word, Titan extended his hand. The gesture wasn't flashy or dramatic, just simple, genuine respect, offered from one professional to another. Chuck accepted it with equal simplicity. As Titan stepped back, a new silence had fallen over the arena, Not the tense anticipation of before, but something more contemplative. The spectators had come expecting entertainment. They were receiving education instead. "I think," Titan said, his voice carrying unexpected sincerity, "I need to rethink some things about fighting." "Not about fighting," Chuck corrected gently. "About yourself." The heavyweight nodded slowly, then moved to join Kai at the edge of the stage. The two champions exchanged glances, a wordless communication passing between them, shared experience of having one's assumptions completely upended. But there was no time for extended reflection. Rafael, El Relampago. Cruz was already stepping forward. His approach neither brash like Kai's, nor intimidating like Titan's. The Mexican featherweight moved with calculated precision, every gesture economical and purposeful. "Fascinating methodology," he said, his accented English precise and formal. "You've demonstrated management of speed and negation of power. But technique," his eyes narrowed slightly, "technique is another matter entirely." Unlike the previous challengers, Rafael approached Chuck not as an upstart facing a legend or a power athlete seeking dominance, but as a technician evaluating a puzzle. His fighting style had always been cerebral, a chess master's approach to violence. Where others relied on athleticism, Rafael relied on analysis. "Technical precision," he continued, beginning to circle Chuck with measured steps, "is mathematics made physical. Every angle calculated. Every response predetermined." Chuck remained centered, turning slightly to keep Rafael in view, but otherwise maintaining his position of quiet readiness. In the VIP section, several martial arts instructors leaned forward in their seats. If the first two challenges had tested Chuck against raw physical attributes, this third encounter would measure him against something potentially more challenging. Systematic, analytical fighting intelligence. Rafael settled into his stance, balanced, efficient, textbook perfect. His expression held neither Kai's cockiness nor Titan's aggression, but something perhaps more dangerous. Absolute confidence in his own technical superiority. "Shall we proceed?" he asked with cold courtesy. Chuck's response was characteristically minimal. A single nod that contained neither anxiety nor eagerness, only calm acceptance of what must come next. The lesson was about to enter its third phase, with wisdom now tested against intellect. Rafael El Relampago. Cruz moved with the precision of a surgeon. Unlike his predecessor's challenges, there was nothing impulsive or emotional in his approach. Each step measured the exact distance between himself and Chuck, each subtle weight shift calculated for maximum efficiency. The crowd sensed the difference immediately. Where Kai had brought spectacle and Titan had brought intimidation, Rafael brought something colder, more methodical, a scientific approach to combat that had earned him not just championships, but the reputation as the most technically perfect fighter of his generation. "In fighting, as in mathematics," Rafael said, his voice carrying the calm certainty of absolute conviction, "there exist optimal solutions to every problem." His Spanish accent gave the words a rhythmic quality, almost musical in their delivery. "For every attack, a perfect counter. For every defense, a perfect breach." Chuck watched him with the same steady gaze he'd maintained throughout, neither intimidated by Rafael's reputation nor dismissive of his approach. If anything, there was the faintest hint of recognition in his eyes, acknowledgement of a kindred analytical mind, albeit one that had reached very different conclusions. In the press section, Aiko Sato leaned forward, her professional detachment momentarily forgotten. "We're witnessing what may be the most intriguing matchup yet," she narrated. Rafael Cruz has been called the human calculator for his ability to process fighting variables in real time. His approach to Chuck Norris appears fundamentally different, less emotional, more strategic. Raphael began his assessment with a probing jab, not thrown with commitment but as a measuring tool, gathering data on Chuck's reactions. Chuck deflected it with minimal movement, but Raphael seemed to absorb something from the interaction. Eyes narrowing slightly. "Interesting," he murmured, almost to himself. "Standard Chung Cook. Do deflection, but modified for efficiency rather than counterattack opportunity." He followed with a more complex sequence jab. Cross, level change, feinted takedown, transitioning to an uppercut. A combination specifically designed to test defensive layers. Each movement flowed into the next with mechanical precision, creating a problem that should have been mathematically unsolvable at Chuck's age. Yet Chuck's response defied conventional analysis. Where Raphael attacked with perfect technique, Chuck defended with perfect timing. It wasn't that his movements were faster or more technically sound. It was that they began precisely when they needed to. Not a millisecond earlier or later. Raphael reset, recalculating. "You've modified traditional responses," he observed, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Removed unnecessary movements. Streamlined the defensive matrix." Chuck inclined his head slightly. Neither confirmation nor denial, just acknowledgement of the observation. The Mexican fighter circled again, his mind visibly processing, recalibrating. When he attacked next, it was with a sequence specifically designed to exploit the weaknesses of Chuck's style, as he understood it, targeting transition points, creating false rhythms to disrupt timing, layering techniques to force defensive compromises. To the amazement of fighting experts watching, Chuck adapted without apparent effort. Where Raphael sought to create mathematical problems, Chuck offered solutions that seemed to exist outside conventional fighting calculus. He didn't counter so much as harmonize, didn't defend so much as redirect. Raphael's expression shifted from clinical assessment to genuine perplexity. For perhaps the first time in his fighting career, his systematic approach wasn't yielding predictable results. The equations weren't balancing. "You're changing the variables," he said, not accusingly but with professional fascination. "Adjusting your responses based on my adjustments to your previous responses." "Fighting isn't mathematics," Chuck replied quietly. "It's conversation." Something about this simple statement seemed to strike Raphael deeply. He paused his circling, head tilted slightly, as he processed the concept. "Explain," he requested, his professional curiosity momentarily overriding the competitive framework. "Mathematics seeks absolute answers," Chuck said. "Conversation seeks understanding." Raphael considered this, then launched another attack. This one, even more technically intricate. Combinations, layered within combinations, each movement setting up contingencies 3 steps ahead. It was fighting as high-level chess, moves and countermoves, calculated to inevitable conclusion. Chuck's response transcended technique. He didn't just defend against the attacks Raphael executed, he responded to the intent behind them. Where the younger fighter sought to create equations, Chuck changed the very nature of the problem. It wasn't just that he avoided being hit, it was that he made Raphael's perfect technique somehow irrelevant. For a brief moment, Raphael managed to maneuver Chuck into what should have been a compromised position. A subtle trap years in the refining. One that had defeated world-class opponents. He executed the finishing sequence flawlessly. A lightning-quick strike that should have been unavoidable. Yet somehow, Chuck was no longer where the strike was aimed. Not because he had moved quickly, but because he had moved early, reading not just Raphael's body, but his intention. The technical fighter stepped back, genuine wonder replacing his clinical assessment. "Impossible," he murmured. You responded before I committed, before I even knew which variation I would choose. You're fighting from the outside in, Chuck said. Technique first, then application. Try reversing the approach. Raphael's brow furrowed as he processed this. He reset his stance, this time with a subtle difference. When he moved again, his attack was simpler but somehow more integrated, less a series of technical components and more a singular expression of purpose. Chuck nodded slightly, approval evident for the first time. He met Raphael's renewed approach not with technique against technique, but with a response that acknowledged the shift in understanding. For a brief moment, the two moved in what looked less like combat and more like collaboration, a physical dialogue about the nature of fighting itself. The exchange ended with Raphael slightly off balance, not from being countered, but from discovering a fundamental gap in his understanding of his own art. He hadn't been defeated. He had been educated. All my life, Raphael said, breathing slightly elevated not from exertion but revelation, I have approached fighting as a problem to be solved, a system to be optimized. And now? Chuck asked. Raphael considered the question carefully. Now I wonder if I've been solving the wrong problem. In the press area, Aiko struggled to articulate what had just transpired. What we're witnessing defies conventional sports narrative, she said. These aren't fights in any traditional sense. They're demonstrations. Lessons. Each champion seems to be encountering not just an opponent, but a fundamental challenge to their understanding of their own art. At the edge of the stage, Kai and Titan watched with newfound respect as Raphael joined them. The three champions exchanged glances, a wordless communication passing between them, the shared experience of having one's assumptions not just challenged but transformed. Did you know what would happen? Kai asked Raphael quietly. The technical fighter shook his head. I thought I was testing him, he replied. But he was examining me. From the sidelines, Yuri, Iron Wolf Petrov, had been observing each encounter with cold, analytical focus. Unlike his colleagues, he had shown no reaction, no surprise, no concern, no curiosity. His face remained as impassive as carved granite. The Russian middleweight champion had built his career on emotional detachment. Where others fought with passion, he fought with mechanical precision. His training had begun in the state-sponsored Sambo programs of post-Soviet Russia, where fighting was approached not as art or sport, but as pure functionality. Efficiency was everything. Emotion was weakness. Now he stepped forward, his movement economical to the point of seeming robotic. No flourish, no ceremony, no acknowledgement of the crowd. His focus remained entirely on Chuck, assessing, calculating. They all made the same mistake, Yuri said. His Russian accent minimal, but his voice flat, devoid of inflection. They fought you. Fighting requires engagement. He settled into his stance, balanced, grounded, fundamentally sound. I will not fight. I will simply execute. The distinction might have seemed semantic to casual observers, but those with fighting knowledge understood the profound difference in approach. Yuri wasn't interested in the philosophical exchange that had characterized the previous encounters. He sought neither validation nor education. He approached combat as a machine might input, processing, output. Chuck regarded him steadily, a new dimension of challenge evident in his eyes. The previous champions had been limited by their egos, their expectations, their assumptions. Yuri appeared limited by something deeper, a fundamental disconnection from the human elements of martial arts. Whenever you're ready, Chuck said simply. The Iron Wolf didn't waste time with preliminaries. He attacked with brutal efficiency, no wasted movement, no unnecessary effort, every strike calculated for maximum impact with minimum telegraphing. His technique wasn't flashy like Kai's or powerful like Titan's or systematically perfect like Raphael's. It was purely functional, developed not to impress or dominate, but to render an opponent inoperative with minimal risk. Chuck met this new approach with adjusted methodology of his own, where he had redirected Kai's speed, absorbed Titan's power, and harmonized with Raphael's technique. He now seemed to mirror Yuri's mechanical precision, matching function with function, efficiency with efficiency. The result was a strangely subdued exchange that nonetheless held the audience spellbound. There were no spectacular movements, no dramatic evasions, no crowd-pleasing counters, just two men operating at the absolute pinnacle of martial efficiency. Yet beneath this apparent similarity of approach, a fundamental difference emerged. Yuri fought with the cold precision of machinery. Chuck moved with the integrated awareness of complete mastery. One was executing a program, the other was expressing a lifetime of understanding. As the exchange continued, something unexpected began to happen. Yuri's mechanical precision started to falter, not from physical fatigue, but from a more subtle form of system failure. His perfectly programmed responses encountered situations they hadn't been designed to address. His emotional detachment, long considered his greatest strength, revealed itself as his most significant limitation. For the first time in his fighting career, Yuri Petrov looked uncertain. It wasn't dramatic, just a momentary hesitation, a flicker of doubt in eyes normally devoid of expression. But in the rarefied atmosphere of elite combat, that microsecond of uncertainty was transformative. Chuck recognized the moment immediately. "Fighting without feeling isn't strength," he said quietly. Just for Yuri's ears. "It's fear disguised as control." The words struck with more impact than any physical blow could have. Yuri's rhythm faltered. His next sequence of attacks came with a subtle but significant difference, a trace of genuine intent behind the mechanical execution. Chuck nodded slightly, acknowledging the shift. "Better," he said. "Now you're present." Something like frustration flickered across Yuri's face, an emotion he had trained himself to suppress for so long that its emergence felt almost like physical pain. His next attack came with unexpected intensity. Technique momentarily compromised by genuine feeling. Chuck moved then, not to counter or defend, but to stabilize. His hands found Yuri's wrists, not to control but to connect. For a brief moment, the two stood in perfect balance, neither advancing nor retreating. "This is the true challenge," Chuck said, his voice carrying clearly despite its quietness. "Not mastering techniques, but mastering yourself. Not removing emotion, but integrating it." Yuri stood frozen, internal conflict evident in his usually expressionless face. The programming that had defined his fighting life confronted a paradox it couldn't resolve. The very detachment he had cultivated as strength was being revealed as limitation. "I don't understand," he said finally, the admission itself a profound departure from his usual certainty. "That's the beginning," Chuck replied. "Understanding starts when you recognize its absence." He released Yuri's wrists and stepped back. The physical exchange concluded. But something far more significant had transpired, not of victory or defeat in any conventional sense, but the planting of a seed in ground long thought infertile. The Russian fighter returned to the sidelines, his expression still largely unreadable but somehow altered. He took his place beside the other three champions, all of whom regarded him with newfound recognition, not as a cold automaton, but as a fellow traveler awakening to a larger journey. In the audience, 20,000 spectators sat in unusual silence. They had come expecting entertainment, perhaps controversy, possibly even the humiliation of an aging legend. Instead, they were witnessing something that transcended sport. A series of encounters that spoke to timeless questions about the nature of mastery itself. Aiko Sato's voice was subdued when she finally spoke into her microphone. "Four champions," she said, each representing a different aspect of fighting excellence: speed, power, technique, and precision. Each approached Chuck Norris with absolute confidence in their methodology. Each has stepped away visibly transformed by the experience. The camera panned to the edge of the stage where only one champion remained: Malik the Lion Adewale. Unlike his colleagues, Malik's expression carried neither shock nor confusion. His eyes had tracked every movement, absorbed every lesson, processed every exchange. But behind his observant calm, a deeper conflict was evident. Of all the champions, Malik's relationship with Chuck Norris was the most complex. He had grown up watching Chuck's films in Nigeria, practicing moves from Walker, Texas Ranger, in his mother's small living room. Chuck had been his first hero, his introduction to martial arts, the reason he had begun the journey that led him to championship. Yet as an adult, he had joined his peers in dismissing those same influences as outdated, irrelevant to the real fighting world he now inhabited. He had laughed at their jokes about movie stars versus actual fighters, added his own cutting remarks about choreography versus combat. He had led the challenge that had precipitated this entire sequence of events. Now he stood at a crossroads, not just professionally, but personally. The final champion to face not just a legend, but his own conflicted relationship with legacy, authenticity, and the deeper meaning of martial arts. Malik stepped forward, his movement carrying none of Kai's flamboyance, Titan's intimidation, Raphael's calculation, or Yuri's mechanical precision. He moved with the natural grace of someone completely comfortable in his physical sovereignty. When he reached the center of the stage, he paused, studying Chuck with eyes that held both challenge and recognition. "The last test," he said, his voice carrying the melodic cadence of his Nigerian heritage. "But I wonder who is really being tested." Chuck's subtle smile acknowledged the insight behind the question. The final encounter was about to begin. Malik the Lion Adewale stood at the center of the stage, the spotlights catching the gleam of the championship belt tattoo on his shoulder, a permanent reminder of the journey that had taken him from the streets of Lagos to global acclaim. His presence carried a different energy than the other champions, neither Kai's showmanship, Titan's intimidation, Raphael's calculation, nor Yuri's cold precision. There was something more integrated about Malik, a wholeness that made him perhaps the most dangerous challenger yet. The Nigerian welterweight champion had earned his nickname not just for his fighting ferocity but for his regal bearing. Even now, facing a legend he had helped mock, he carried himself with unmistakable dignity. But behind the composed exterior, conflict churned. "I have a confession," Malik said, his voice carrying the melodic cadence of his homeland, but trained in the international diction of a global athlete. "When I was 10 years old, I broke my mother's favorite vase practicing a roundhouse kick I saw you do in Missing in Action." A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the crowd. It was the last thing anyone had expected him to say. The faintest hint of a smile touched Chuck's eyes, though his expression remained composed. "She was furious," Malik continued. "But instead of punishment, she saved money for 3 months to buy me karate lessons." He paused, the weight of memory evident in his voice. "She said, if I was going to break things, I should at least learn to do it properly." From the sidelines, the other 4 champions watched with varying expressions of surprise. This wasn't the confrontation they had anticipated. Malik was taking the encounter into territory. None of them had considered the personal, the authentic. In the press area, Aiko Sato leaned closer to her microphone. "We're witnessing an unexpected turn," she narrated quietly. Malik Adewale, often called the most complete fighter of his generation, appears to be acknowledging Chuck Norris as an early influence rather than confronting him. Chuck studied Malik carefully, seeing beyond the physical presence to the internal struggle beneath. Of all the champions, Malik was the most difficult to read. Not because he hid his emotions like Yuri, but because he contained multitudes. Why lead the challenge? Chuck asked simply. The question cut straight to the heart of the matter. Malik's shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath. Because it's easier to reject your heroes than to live up to them, he answered with unexpected candor. A hush fell over the arena. The raw honesty of the exchange had transformed the atmosphere from spectacle to something more intimate, more authentic. 20,000 spectators found themselves witnesses to a conversation that felt almost too personal for public consumption. I convinced myself that what we do now is more real, more valid. Malik continued. That the old ways were just for show, that people like you, he gestured toward Chuck, belonged in the past. It was easier than admitting I might never measure up to what you represent. Chuck nodded once, understanding evident in his eyes. The weight of legacy is heavy, he acknowledged, especially when you carry it alone. Yet here you stand, Malik said, carrying it with ease. Not ease, Chuck corrected gently. Practice. Malik considered this, then settled into a fighting stance. Not aggressive, not flashy, but fundamentally sound. His position reflected neither modern MMA nor traditional karate, but a synthesis that acknowledged both lineages. I still need to know, he said, his voice quieter now. Not for the cameras, not for them. He glanced briefly toward the other champions. For myself. Chuck nodded, settling into his own stance. The two men stood balanced, centered, eyes locked in mutual recognition. This wasn't a challenge anymore. It was a question asked in the oldest language of human movement. The exchange that followed defied conventional description. It wasn't a fight in any recognizable sense. It was a physical dialogue. A testing not of superiority, but of understanding. Malik moved with fluid grace. His attacks neither committed enough to damage nor restrained enough to be mere demonstration. Each technique carried a question. Is this real? Am I authentic? Is there truth in what I've built? Chuck's responses contained neither dismissal nor indulgence. He met Malik's inquiry with clarity, redirecting without negating, challenging without diminishing. His movements acknowledged the validity of the younger fighter's approach while simultaneously revealing its limitations. To the audience, it appeared almost like a dance, two masters speaking a language most could hear but couldn't comprehend. The physical vocabulary transcended style, transcended era, addressing fundamental principles that remained unchanged across decades of martial evolution. As the exchange deepened, something shifted in Malik's approach. The performance elements fell away. The awareness of the crowd dimmed. His movement became more essential, more honest. With each passing moment, the constructed identity of the Lion Champion, celebrity, brand receded, revealing simply the man beneath. In that vulnerable authenticity, Malik found himself executing a sequence he hadn't planned. A combination drawn not from his modern training, but from those early days mimicking Chuck's films in his mother's living room. The movement was raw, unpolished by current standards, but carried a sincerity that transcended technical perfection. Chuck recognized it immediately, a sequence from his own early days, preserved like a fossil impression in Malik's muscle memory. His response was not to counter, but to complete the exchange, offering the follow-up movements that the young Malik could never have learned from watching films. The moment hit Malik with unexpected emotional force. This wasn't just physical dialogue anymore. It was reconnection with the purest part of his own journey. The boy who had fallen in love with martial arts before belts, before championships, before fame had complicated everything. He stepped back, breathing controlled but eyes revealing the internal revelation. All these years, he said quietly, chasing something I already had. Chuck's gaze held understanding. The path forward sometimes requires returning to the beginning. For a moment, the two men stood in perfect stillness, the legend and the champion, the past and the present, each acknowledging the truth in the other. Then, with deliberate care, Malik did something that sent a shocked murmur through the arena. He knelt. Not in submission or defeat, but in the traditional gesture of respect offered from student to teacher. His eyes remained level, dignity intact, the action carrying no humiliation but profound acknowledgement. The gesture transformed the atmosphere in the Tokyo Dome. What had begun as spectacle evolved into demonstration and deepened into philosophy, now revealed itself as something more fundamental, a ceremony of recognition, transcending language, culture, and time. From the sidelines, the other champions watched in stunned silence. None had expected this outcome, least of all from Malik, their de facto leader, the one who had been most vocal in challenging the legends. Slowly, Rafael Cruz stepped forward. The technical fighter who had approached combat as mathematics had found his calculations upended. After a moment of visible internal struggle, he too knelt beside Malik. Yuri Petrov, the emotionless machine whose programming had encountered a paradox, moved next, his usually impassive face showing the faintest trace of uncertainty as he joined his fellow champions. Titan Brooks towered even on one knee, his massive frame awkward in the position but his expression revealing the humility that had replaced arrogance. Last came Kai Tanaka, the hometown hero whose flashy confidence had been the first to challenge Chuck. The Japanese fighter hesitated longest, his pride warring visibly with newfound respect. But finally, he too knelt, completing the circle. 5 world champions, each at the absolute pinnacle of modern combat sports, each with millions of followers, endorsement contracts, and fearsome reputations, knelt in unified acknowledgement before an aging legend who had not thrown a single punch throughout the entire encounter. The crowd witnessed the moment in breathless silence. Cameras flashed, capturing what would become one of the most iconic images in martial arts history. In the press section, Aiko Sato found herself momentarily speechless, the narrative having transcended conventional sports reporting. Chuck regarded the kneeling champions with quiet dignity. There was no triumph in his bearing, no satisfaction at having proved something. Instead, he stepped forward and extended his hand to Malik first. "True strength," he said as he helped the Nigerian fighter to his feet, "never needs to announce itself." One by one, he assisted each champion to standing, the gesture transforming what might have been seen as submission into mutual respect. As each rose, something in their bearing had changed, not diminished, but somehow clarified, as if unnecessary elements had been stripped away, leaving something more essential. When all 5 stood again, Chuck addressed them not as opponents but as fellow travelers on the same path. "Fighting is easy," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the now silent arena. "Mastery takes a lifetime. And true mastery is recognizing that the journey never ends." He turned to address the wider audience, his gaze taking in the thousands of spectators who had witnessed something they hadn't expected but wouldn't soon forget. "Martial arts isn't about who's stronger or faster or more technical," he continued. "It's about becoming better today than you were yesterday. Not better than someone else, better than yourself." The simple truth of his words resonated through the vast space. This wasn't the choreographed wisdom of movie scripts or the manufactured drama of sports entertainment. It was the distilled insight of a genuine journey shared without pretension. These champions, Chuck gestured to the 5 fighters, showed more strength in this moment of humility than in all their victories combined. That's the paradox at the heart of martial arts. True power comes from vulnerability, true victory from surrender, true mastery from eternal studentship. In the front row, Sensei Kuroda nodded slowly, satisfaction evident in his weathered features. The lesson had been delivered exactly as needed, not through words or philosophy, but through direct experience. The old master had seen many students over his lifetime, but few teachers who understood that the deepest lessons couldn't be explained, only encountered. Malik stepped forward, no longer as a challenger but as a bridge between generations. He turned to face the crowd. His natural charisma now channeled into something more authentic than performance. "We came here tonight, thinking we would prove something," he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine revelation. "Instead, we discovered how much we still have to learn." He glanced at Chuck, respect evident in his eyes. Not just about fighting, but about living with purpose and integrity. The crowd's response began as a ripple, then swelled into sustained applause, not the frenzied reaction of spectators witnessing violence, but the deeper appreciation of witnesses to transformation. This wasn't what they had paid to see, but it was something far more valuable than expected. Aiko Sato found her voice again, though it carried an uncharacteristic trace of emotion. "What began as confrontation has transformed into what can only be described as a ceremonial passing of wisdom," she narrated. 5 world champions who arrived intending to debunk a legend have instead become part of his legacy. On stage, the event director approached cautiously, uncertain how to proceed with an exhibition that had veered so dramatically from the planned program. But before he could speak, Malik raised a hand. "I believe," the Nigerian champion said with quiet authority, "we should continue with the showcase as originally intended, but with a different purpose." He looked to his fellow champions, receiving nods of agreement. Not as a competition between eras, but as a celebration of this journey we all share. Chuck nodded his approval, then began to move toward the edge of the stage. His part in this drama was complete. The lesson had been delivered. The connection made. The circle closed. Now it was time for the new generation to carry forward what they had learned. But as he reached the steps, Malik called after him. "Mr. Norris," he said, using the formal address for the first time. "Would you stay? Not to prove anything, but to share?" Chuck paused, then turned back. In his eyes was something that hadn't been visible throughout the confrontations, a gentle warmth. The humanity behind the legend. He nodded once, accepting the invitation not as challenge but as genuine request. "I'd be honored," he replied simply. As the showcase prepared to transition to its originally scheduled demonstrations, now infused with newfound purpose and mutual respect, the atmosphere in Tokyo Dome had fundamentally transformed. What had begun as spectacle had become ceremony. What had been marketed as entertainment had delivered education. And somewhere in that vast audience, countless young martial artists watching their modern heroes kneel in respect before a living legend absorbed a lesson more valuable than any technique. True mastery exists, not in domination, but in humility. Not in defeating others, but in transcending oneself. The night was far from over, but its most important message had already been delivered, not through words but through the oldest language known to humanity, the honest movement of bodies in space. Asking and answering questions that transcend time. In the quiet stillness between moments, wisdom had been transmitted. Not as information, but as experience. Not as history, but as living tradition. The legend would continue, not as nostalgia, but as inspiration. And the silence that had spoken louder than any words would echo in the lives of all who had witnessed it, long after the lights of Tokyo Dome went dark. The sun rose over Tokyo the following morning, its light catching the glass and steel of the cityscape. But the conversation reverberating through dojos, gyms, social media, and news outlets wasn't about architectural marvels or technological innovations. It was about silence, the profound silence of a legend who had spoken volumes without raising his voice or landing a single blow. In a quiet hotel room overlooking the Imperial Gardens, Chuck Norris sat in meditation, his morning ritual unchanged, despite the previous night's events. His phone lay silent but illuminated on the nightstand, notifications numbering in the thousands. The world wanted to hear from him now, eager for sound bites and wisdom, but the man who had demonstrated the power of restraint continued to embody it. Across town, in the lavish suite reserved for international athletes, Malik Adewale stood at the window, watching the same sunrise with new eyes. On the coffee table behind him lay his phone, open to a video call connecting him to Lagos, where his mother's weathered face beamed with quiet pride. "You understand now, yes?" she asked, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had guided him since childhood. "I think I'm beginning to," Malik replied, the humility in his tone unfamiliar but somehow freeing. "All these years chasing glory, and I never realized what I was really looking for." His mother nodded, unsurprised. "Some lessons can't be taught, only discovered." In 5 different locations across Tokyo, 5 champions began their day, not as adversaries or even colleagues, but as students sharing an unexpected revelation. What had been planned as a publicity stunt had transformed into a profound inflection point in each of their journeys. At the headquarters of Global Sports Network, Aiko Sato reviewed the footage that had already been viewed hundreds of millions of times worldwide. Her producer leaned over her shoulder, eyes gleaming with the recognition of historic content. "We need to frame this correctly," he said. "The narrative is everything." Aiko nodded absently, but her focus remained on the silent figure at the center of the storm. The man who had transformed confrontation into communion without ever raising his voice above conversational level. "Maybe," she said thoughtfully, "the most powerful part of this story is that it doesn't need our framing at all." By midday, clips from the event had been edited into countless variations, each highlighting different aspects of the unprecedented encounter. Commentary ranged from technical analysis of Chuck's movement efficiency to philosophical explorations of intergenerational knowledge transfer. But what remained most striking to viewers was the image of 5 world champions kneeling in unified recognition, an unscripted moment of authentic humility, in a sport often defined by its opposite. At a small traditional tea house near the Sensoji Temple, Sensei Kuroda sat across from his old friend, both men content in the comfortable silence of decades-long companionship. "They will misinterpret, of course," Kuroda finally said, pouring fresh tea with practiced precision. "They will say you defeated 5 champions." Chuck smiled faintly. "We both know better." "Yes," the Japanese master agreed. "You showed them how they defeat themselves. The hardest lesson." He sipped his tea thoughtfully. "But tell me, old friend, did you anticipate such a dramatic demonstration?" "I expected resistance," Chuck replied. "I didn't expect recognition." Their conversation was interrupted by a polite knock. The tea house attendant bowed apologetically. "Forgive the intrusion, but there are visitors asking for you both." Standing at the entrance were Malik and the 4 other champions, their usual entourages noticeably absent. They had come not for publicity or performance, but for something more essential. "We hoped," Malik said with genuine humility, "that you might share tea with us." The old masters exchanged glances. Then Kuroda gestured to the empty cushions around the low table. No words were needed beyond the invitation itself. As they settled into the traditional space, the contrast between modern athletes and ancient practice created a visual bridge between worlds, often perceived as separate, competitive and philosophical, commercial and traditional, Western and Eastern. But in this quiet moment, those distinctions dissolved into something more integrated, more authentic. They didn't speak of contracts or competitions, of sponsorships or social media. Instead, they asked questions about journeys both physical and spiritual. They listened more than they talked. They began the process not of rejecting their modern understanding, but of deepening it, enriching it with wisdom that couldn't be captured in training apps or performance metrics. Later that afternoon, as originally scheduled, the Legends vs. Champions showcase continued at Tokyo Dome. But what had been conceptualized as entertainment had transformed into education. The 5 champions demonstrated their styles not to prove superiority, but to honor lineage. Chuck participated not as competitor, but as collaborator, the exchange between generations flowing in both directions. The audience witnessed something unprecedented in modern combat sports. A genuine transmission of wisdom unconcerned with ego or commercial considerations. In an age of carefully cultivated personas and strategic branding, the naked authenticity proved more compelling than any manufactured drama could have been. As evening fell and the event concluded, Chuck stood once more at the center of the stage. The 5 champions arrayed around him, not in challenge, but in concert. No speeches were necessary. The silent transformation spoke for itself. When they bowed together, legend and champions, past and present, teacher and students, wisdom and power, they embodied the paradox at the heart of all martial arts. True strength requires vulnerability, true victory demands surrender, and true mastery begins with eternal studentship. The noise of the crowd rose to a crescendo, then faded into memory. But the silence, that profound silence that had spoken louder than any words, continued to echo, a ripple expanding outward through lives and lineages yet to come. Up next we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.